The room was filled with smiles, dancing lights and loud music, but none of it seemed real as my eyes took in the scene. Her dress, red like the blood that pulsed at my temples, swirled as she laughed, another man's steady arms guiding her across the room. Their every gesture felt like an invisible blow to my chest. The party, which was supposed to celebrate a milestone in our history, became the stage for a show that I had not asked to watch. The music seemed to fade in volume around me, the buzz of conversation fading into a distant echo as I absorbed the betrayal before me. It was not an innocent dance. It was a mockery, a deliberate affront to my presence. They knew I was there. They knew I would see. And maybe that was what hurt the most. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the certainty that she had completely lost the respect she had once said she felt for me. I remained motionless for long seconds, feeling the heat rise through my body like a wave that swallowed me completely. Her laughter resonated, echoing in my mind. Each note seemed to mock me, daring me to react. "Everything is fine," someone asked next to me, but my voice seemed to have disappeared. I took a deep breath, trying to suffocate the anger and humiliation that consumed me, but the weight was crushing. I couldn't let that continue. Not this time. She twirled once more, her eyes shining as if she were in a world where I didn't exist. When they finally broke away from the dance, the man leaned over and whispered something in her ear. The smile she offered in response made me fall apart. There was no way to pretend anymore. There were no more masks to support. I raised my glass, tapping lightly on the glass, the crystal clear sound cutting through the room and attracting looks. "I want everyone's attention for a moment," I began, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. She froze, the smile disappearing from her face, and for an instant, I saw fear flash through her eyes. "I want to announce something important. A milestone that tonight symbolizes for me," I continued, feeling all eyes turn to me. The words came out with more force than I imagined possible. "I want to announce that I am divorcing someone who betrayed and despised me. From someone who had the audacity to dance with their lover in front of me, in complete disregard for the history we built together." The hall was completely silent. People looked at each other, some in disbelief, others clearly uncomfortable. She stood still, her hands clenching her skirt, her eyes wide and searching for some way to deny the inevitable. The man next to her took a step back, visibly disconcerted. I can explain," she stammered, "but my decision was already made. There are no more explanations that matter to me. The only thing that matters now is that I won't allow them to continue treating me like an idiot," I replied, feeling the weight of those words lift a burden off of me. The rest of the night was a blur of shocked expressions, whispers, and burning gazes. She tried to follow me as I left the room, begging for a conversation. Her words, filled with despair, resonated like a distorted melody as she desperately sought to justify what she had done. But I had no more ears for her excuses. What I had witnessed in that dance was not something that could be explained in words. It was a raw truth, exposed in gestures and smiles that tore apart everything that once meant security and love. As I drove home, the silence inside the car was filled with the cacophony of my own thoughts. How did we get to this point? At what point did the years of complicity and love turn into this grotesque theater? Every memory shared now felt like a burden, every promise made crumbled like ashes in the wind. But fate had not finished its cruel play. When I got home, the first thing I saw was my oldest daughter in the living room. Her eyes were red and her face was soaked with tears. "Dad, did you know?" she asked, her voice fragile but filled with an anger I hadn't expected. "Did you know she was with him? This man, he's the father of a friend of mine, someone I trusted. I saw you guys today at the party, and it all made sense. I knew she was distant, but I didn't want to believe it." My shattered heart now felt pulverized. The weight of betrayal was not enough, but also the pain of knowing that my daughter had been hit by this whirlwind of disloyalty. Trying to stay calm, I sat next to her. "I didn't know everything," I confessed, feeling each word weigh like lead. But now I know, and I'm going to fix it. I'm not going to let her destroy any more than she already has." Her tears turned into a mix of sobs and confused words about how she felt betrayed not only by her mother, but by a world that seemed less safe. As she vented, I knew that the consequences of that night were far from over. There were more layers to unravel, more buried secrets waiting to surface. And so, in the midst of that chaos, I asked myself, how high would the price of this betrayal go? What other hidden truths are about to be revealed? What else could rise from the ashes of what I once thought was a solid life built on love and trust? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. All stories presented are fictional, created to show how betrayal can destroy lives and leave deep scars. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists and turns, where the impact of choices will be revealed in a raw and exciting way. I wish you a good story. Now, get ready to hear something truly shocking. The red brick house, surrounded by an impeccable garden, was the perfect reflection of Ethan and Laura's wedding. At least, that's how it seemed to those who saw them from the outside. Married for over 15 years, they were the type of couple who inspired admiration at parties and social gatherings. Ethan, a successful lawyer, was known for his eloquence and imposing posture. Laura, on the other hand, was the embodiment of grace and sophistication, with her always impeccable presence and a smile that seemed to carry the world in balance. Together, they were the image of stability in harmony. But appearances, as so often happen, were deceiving. Although the marriage seemed perfect, the cracks had long been present, hidden beneath layers of routine and convenience. Ethan was a methodical man, someone who believed in the power of small traditions to sustain large commitments. He set aside every Friday night for dinner with Laura, always at the same restaurant, a ritual he considered a reminder of his vows. Laura, on the other hand, no longer saw the same charm in these meetings as before. The predictability that had once comforted her now suffocated her, as if Ethan's every meticulously calculated gesture was a reminder that something was missing. In the first years of their marriage, they had shared dreams, goals that united them in an almost visceral way. Buy a house, build a family, achieve professional stability. When these goals were achieved, the connection that held them together seemed to somehow weaken. They didn't talk about it. Instead, they filled the void with social engagements, planned trips and, eventually, silence. The silence between them grew like a shadow, invading even the simplest moments. Ethan, absorbed by the demands of the office, justified his emotional absence with work responsibilities. He believed he was guaranteeing their future, while Laura, who had abandoned a promising career in fashion to dedicate herself to her home and her husband, began to question where she had lost herself in this process. She still loved Ethan, but the love now came with a weight, a feeling that something important had been neglected over the years. Laura found solace in her social circle, a group of friends who shared similar interests. Among them, there was one in particular who always seemed willing to listen. A yoga buddy, with whom he began sharing light conversations about hobbies and books, which eventually turned into deeper dialogues about dreams and regrets. She didn't see the harm in these conversations, as she thought they were just an escape, a space where she could be seen in a way that Ethan seemed to have forgotten. Meanwhile, Ethan was immersed in his routine, not noticing the signs that Laura left. Little comments about how he felt invisible or how he missed surprises in his marriage went unnoticed by him. He believed that his financial effort and dedication were enough to demonstrate the love he felt, but Laura longed for something more, something that could not be bought or planned. Their home, although elegant and inviting, was now a reflection of what their marriage had become. Everything was in its place, but there was a lack of soul, life. Dinner in the dining room, with dim lights and classical music in the background, was more of a habit than a shared experience. The conversation revolved around practical matters, such as bills to be paid and dates to set appointments. Ethan tried to ignore the heaviness in the air, while Laura avoided saying what she really felt, fearing that such a raw truth could destroy them. There was, however, one last ray of hope for Ethan. The party he had thrown to celebrate an important milestone in his career was, for him, an opportunity to reconnect with Laura. He meticulously planned every detail, from the sophisticated decor to the carefully curated guest list. Ethan believed that by showing Laura how important she was by his side, he could rekindle what seemed to be fading between them. Laura, in turn, saw the party differently. For her, it was another social obligation, another night where she would need to wear a rehearsed smile while trying to find something real amid the superficiality of everything. Still, she prepared carefully, choosing a dress that she knew would turn heads and boost her confidence. There was, in her reflection in the mirror, something she hadn't seen in a long time, a desire for something that was just hers, a feeling that would connect her again with who she believed she had been before marriage. When the night of the party arrived, the house was spotless. The illuminated garden created a magical ambience, while the main hall pulsed with the energy of conversation and laughter. Ethan circulated among the guests, greeting everyone with his usual charisma. He looked at Laura with admiration, believing that she was the perfect host, an extension of everything he wanted to project into the world. But Laura was distant, even though she was physically present. The compliments she received seemed to echo in a void inside her, and the looks she exchanged with a particular person made the air seem heavier. Ethan didn't notice. He was focused on ensuring that everything went according to plan, believing that the success of the party would be a reflection of the success of the wedding. Laura, on the other hand, moved around the room as if she were in two worlds at once. There was a weight on her shoulders, but also a lightness in her heart, as if something inside her was awakening after years of lying dormant. The night wore on, and Ethan finally approached Laura. He asked her to dance, something he hadn't done in years, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that was enough. But when another pair of eyes met hers from across the room, everything seemed to change. She backed away, apologizing to Ethan, and disappeared into the crowd, leaving him alone on the dance floor. The music kept playing, the guests kept laughing, but to Ethan, something seemed out of place. He looked around, looking for Laura, not knowing that this search would lead him to a truth that would change everything he believed to be solid in his life. The night continued with the same brightness and intensity that Ethan had idealized, but, at the same time, there was something imperceptible to most of the guests that silently changed the course of that party. Laura's smile was brighter than ever, and her interactions seemed to flow naturally. She moved through the room with the grace of someone who knows the terrain well, but there was a spark in her eyes, something new, something that perhaps she herself did not fully understand. Ethan, immersed in the euphoria of being the center of attention, barely noticed the nuances that escaped less attentive eyes. He believed that night was a reflection of his success and, by extension, the strength of his marriage. Guests formed into lively groups, swapping stories and toasting Ethan's success. But in the background, in a less lit corner, Laura stood out in a way that went unnoticed by everyone except one person. He was there, following her with a look that said more than any words. The two spoke with the kind of intimacy that wasn't exactly explicit, but that carried an almost palpable weight. There were no compromising touches or gestures, just looks and smiles that created an invisible world between them, while the rest of the party continued at a pace unrelated to what was happening there. Ethan, wrapped in his bubble of satisfaction, finally found a moment to approach Laura. He held her hand firmly and pulled her onto the dance floor. For the first time in a long time, they were close, and she tried to give herself over to that moment, but Laura's mind was far away. Ethan, however, didn't notice. For him, that moment seemed like a reaffirmation that everything was in the right place, even if the sparkle in Laura's eyes wasn't meant for him. As they danced, the other man, discreetly positioned next to a group of guests, watched. There was a mix of confidence and defiance in her posture, as if she knew that this dance wouldn't change anything. It was a silent game of teasing that Ethan still didn't understand was happening. Laura exchanged another look with the one who was, for her, an anchor in the midst of the emotional storm she was experiencing, and Ethan, ignorant of the weight of it all, held her more firmly, trying in some way to create a connection that he didn't even know about. Who was in danger? The night continued, and Laura moved away in search of a moment of solitude. She needed air, a break to organize the thoughts that were racing through her mind. He found refuge in the garden, where the soft lights created shadows that seemed to hide his inner turmoil. Before he could compose himself, a familiar voice interrupted his reverie. He was there, beside her, with the same expression of understanding and intensity that had attracted her from the beginning. His words were calm, reassuring, but they carried an implicit provocation, something that challenged Laura to recognize what she felt and what she wanted. She tried to resist, tried to remember who she was and what she should protect, but there was something in that moment, in that exchange of words and looks, that made her defenses crumble. Inside the house, Ethan noticed Laura's absence. He asked a few guests, but everyone seemed too busy to notice what was beginning to seem like a growing concern to him. He went to the garden, where the last memory of her presence seemed to have taken him. There, he found not emptiness, but something he still couldn't name. Laura was standing, too close to someone who shouldn't be there, laughing at something that Ethan didn't hear, but that echoed like a warning. He stood still for a few seconds, observing the scene with a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. When he finally found the strength to approach, the two had already moved away, as if something had alerted them that they were being watched. Tension grew in Ethan, even as he tried to rationalize what he had seen. He wasn't the kind of man to let insecurities lead him, but there was something about that exchange, something that planted a seed of doubt. He returned to the hall, where he tried to maintain his posture, greeting the guests and maintaining a smile, but his restlessness wouldn't leave him alone. Laura returned some time later, appearing as calm as before, but to Ethan, everything seemed like a carefully rehearsed play. Her every gesture seemed calculated, every word an attempt to fill in gaps he now couldn't ignore. As the night progressed, Ethan began to notice more than he would have liked. He saw the looks that man gave Laura, he saw the way she, even trying to hide it, reacted to them. The perception that something was out of place began to turn into a certainty that he didn't want to admit. The party, which before seemed to be a celebration of everything he believed he had built, was now a scene of uncertainty and suspicion that grew every moment. The decisive moment came when Ethan, while trying to find Laura again, saw her on the dance floor. But this time, it wasn't him. She was dancing with the man who now seemed to have invaded the space he thought was just theirs. It was more than a dance. It was a silent declaration, a gesture that carried the full weight of something Ethan couldn't ignore. He stopped in the distance, his eyes fixed on that scene, his heart racing, while everything around him seemed to fade away. The music continued, but Ethan couldn't hear anything else. His mind spiraled with questions and conclusions that he didn't know how to process. When the dance finally ended and the two walked away, Laura's gaze met his. For a brief moment, the silence between them said more than any words could express. Laura tried to get closer, but Ethan backed away, unable to deal with what he was feeling at that moment. As he left the party, each step felt like a monumental effort, as if he were carrying the weight of everything he had witnessed. He needed answers, he needed to understand how all this had happened before his eyes without him noticing. But the only thing he knew for sure was that the night wasn't over yet. And what was to come would forever change the course of their lives. Ethan spent the night awake, images of the party playing like a worn-out movie in his mind. Every look, every gesture, every laugh between Laura and that man seemed to settle like an unbearable weight. Anger was mixed with disbelief, and the questions accumulated, one overlapping the other, without any finding an answer. For the first time in years, he felt like the ground beneath his feet was uncertain, like everything he knew was about to crumble. When the sun finally rose, bringing an uncomfortable brightness to his living room, Ethan decided he could no longer ignore what was before him. He waited for Laura in the kitchen, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee contrasting with the tension in the air. She entered with hesitant steps, her face paler than usual, and the expression of someone who knew a confrontation was inevitable. Ethan wasted no time, his words came out straight, cutting like blades. He wanted to know everything, every detail, every motivation that led her to dance with another man in front of him, in front of everyone, as if their marriage was a decorative piece that no longer mattered. Laura tried to explain herself, the words coming out confused, mixing justifications and excuses that only increased Ethan's frustration. She mentioned the weight of the routine, the emptiness she felt, but none of that seemed enough to justify what had happened. Ethan interrupted her, his voice filled with a calm that was almost more frightening than the overt anger. He wanted concrete answers, not beating around the bush, but Laura hesitated, as if there was something deeper that she didn't know how to say. Before he could insist, the sound of the front door echoed through the house. Ethan and Laura turned at the same time, and the man Ethan instantly recognized from the party entered. He was tense, his eyes fixed on Laura, completely ignoring Ethan's presence. "We need to talk," he said, his voice thick with urgency, but Ethan didn't give him the opportunity to continue. He stood up, taking a few steps forward, his body rigid with tension, demanding to know who he was and what he was doing there. The answer came as a blow: he was Connor, the father of their daughter's friend, someone who, until then, seemed to have no direct connection to Laura. The silence that followed was deafening as Ethan tried to process what that meant. He looked at Laura, waiting for her to say something, but she seemed unable to find the words. Connor then broke the silence, explaining that the relationship between him and Laura was not just a casual friendship. There was something more, something that began as an exchange of confidences and spiraled out of control. He seemed genuinely sorry, but his words only increased Ethan's anger. The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan turned to Laura, waiting for her to confirm or deny, to say anything that made sense, but what she said hit him like a punch. "It wasn't just about us," she began, her voice low, charged with emotion. "Connor and I, we're trying to find a way to deal with something bigger, something that wasn't just about the two of us." Ethan didn't understand. He demanded explanations, his voice louder now, but Laura hesitated, tears beginning to roll down her face. It was Connor who revealed the secret that Laura couldn't tell. He told her about his daughter, Sophie, who was friends with Ethan and Laura's daughter. Sophie had discovered their relationship weeks earlier and, unable to cope with the weight of it, confronted her father and Laura. She threatened to tell Ethan everything, but Connor and Laura convinced her not to say anything, believing they could resolve the situation before everything fell apart. The tension between them was more than a case, it was the fear of the consequences that could fall on the children, on the families. Ethan froze, unable to process it all at once. He looked at Laura, searching for some sign of remorse, something that showed she still cared about what they had, but all he saw was a face marked by the weight of her choices. The pain he felt was so deep that he could barely breathe. He needed to get out of there, he needed space to understand how his life had become such chaos. Before leaving, he turned to Connor, anger finally boiling over. "You destroyed my family," he said, his voice firm but full of emotion. "And you," he looked at Laura, "let this happen. I don't know how I'm going to get over this, but you both need to know that it doesn't end here." He left the house, feeling that each step took him further away from the man he had been until that moment. The weight of the betrayal and the secret that had been revealed hung over him, and he knew the worst was yet to come. Ethan walked aimlessly through the city streets, his thoughts in a disorganized whirlwind. Each step seemed to echo the weight of the revelations that hit him like a punch, bringing to the surface a mixture of pain, anger, and disbelief. He tried to find logic in the chaos that had formed, but the pieces of the puzzle didn't fit together. It wasn't just the fact that Laura had cheated, but the depth and consequences of what she now knew. Connor and Laura's words hammered in his mind, carrying a weight he never imagined carrying. Finding himself in front of a park, he sat on an empty bench, his head bowed, as memories of his life with Laura flashed by like incessant flashes. He remembered the early years, the shared enthusiasm, the promises made. How had it turned into this? How could someone he loved so much become a stranger? He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cold breeze on his face, trying to regain control over the emotions that consumed him. Meanwhile, Laura remained at home, staring at the emptiness around her. Connor had left shortly after Ethan left, leaving her alone with the wreckage of what had once been her life. The silence in the house was deafening, and she felt like every shadow reflected the choices she had made, the consequences she now faced. She knew she needed to talk to Ethan, that she needed to face the damage she had caused, but fear paralyzed her. She had made mistakes, serious mistakes, and she didn't know if there was room for redemption. Hours later, Ethan finally returned home. The sound of the door opening made Laura stand up immediately, her heart beating fast as she tried to find the right words. He entered, his face more marked than she had ever seen it, and the eyes that had always looked at her with love were now filled with something she couldn't completely decipher. He walked to the living room and sat down, exhaling a long sigh, as if carrying the weight of the world. "Why, Laura?" he finally asked, his voice low, almost hoarse. "I want to understand. Not just what you did, but why. Why have we reached this point?" Laura swallowed, feeling the weight of the question. There were no simple answers, and she knew that every word she said could make things even worse. "I don't know where to start," she said, her voice shaking. "I was lost, Ethan. Lost in a routine, in a void that I didn't know how to fill. Connor, he showed up at a time when I was vulnerable, and I made terrible choices. But I never wanted it to destroy you." He shook his head, disbelief written all over his face. "Did you never want it to destroy me? Laura, you destroyed everything. You put our daughter in the middle of this, you let her deal with a weight that no child should have to carry. And now, I have to deal with this, while you say you were lost? Is that all?" His words hit her like a slap, and tears began to stream down her face. "I know I was wrong, Ethan. I know I hurt you, our daughter, everything we built. But I never wanted things to come to this. I thought there was still a chance to fix things, to find a way to reconnect." "Fix things," he repeated, his voice thick with bitterness. "Laura, this is not a broken vase that you can glue together and pretend it never cracked. This is our life, and you made choices that destroyed everything. I gave you everything, everything I had, and it still wasn't enough." She tried to get closer, but he raised his hand, asking her to stop. "I need time," he said finally, his voice quieter now but still full of pain. "I need to understand what I'm going to do from here, because at this point, I don't know. I don't know if I can look at you and see the woman I once loved." Laura didn't insist. She knew that nothing she said could change how he felt at that moment. She just nodded, tears falling silently, as Ethan walked up the stairs and disappeared into the room. The house seemed even emptier now, filled with a heavy silence that seemed to echo everything that hadn't been said. The next morning, Ethan decided he needed an outside perspective. He sought advice from a close friend, someone he had known for years and who he knew would be honest. Sitting in a coffee shop, he told her everything, from Laura's betrayal to the impact it had on their daughter. His friend listened intently, without interrupting, and when Ethan finished, he let out a deep sigh. "Ethan, I'm not going to tell you what to do," he began, choosing his words carefully. "But what you need to decide now is what you want for the future. What happened was terrible, and no one would blame you for getting out of that situation. But if there's a part of you that still believes there can be redemption, that still loves Laura, then maybe it's worth a try. Not for her, but for you. Because living with regrets can be as devastating as betrayal." Ethan pondered these words, but they held no answers, only more questions. He knew he needed more than advice. He needed action, he needed clarity, he needed something to help him rebuild his life, one way or another. When he returned home, he found Laura in the kitchen, looking out the window with a lost look. He didn't know what to say, but he knew that silence wouldn't solve anything. "I don't know what will happen between us," he said finally. "But I know we need to be honest from now on. For both of us, and for our daughter. If there's any chance of getting past this, it's going to start with the truth. The whole truth." Laura turned to him, her eyes full of emotion. I'm ready to tell you everything, she said, her voice firm but with a hint of sadness. Even if it means losing you forever. The tension in the house was almost tangible. Each room seemed filled with the weight of the words spoken the night before, as the silence between Ethan and Laura took on an almost physical presence. They both walked through the house like shadows, avoiding meeting eyes, but they knew that, sooner or later, they would need to face what still hovered between them. The day was bright, ironic in its indifference to the emotional chaos that dominated their lives. Ethan looked around the familiar corners of the living room, remembering moments that now seemed to belong to another life. He knew the next step needed to be taken, but what that meant was still an unanswered question. Laura, on the other hand, seemed to sink deeper and deeper into her guilt and uncertainty. The idea that she would lose Ethan, and with him the life they had built, was unbearable, but she also felt like she had no right to fight for something she herself had destroyed. Guilt weighed on her shoulders like an anchor as she tried to organize her thoughts and prepare herself for what she knew was coming, a decision from Ethan that would change the course of everything. It was Ethan who finally broke the silence. He was in the kitchen, his fingers drumming nervously on the table, while he looked at Laura as if searching for something in her eyes, something that could justify or at least alleviate the burden he was carrying. He spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant, but full of firmness. "We need to talk, for real, bluntly this time. I need to understand where we are now and what, if anything, we can still salvage." Laura nodded slowly, nervousness evident in her every movement. She knew there was no more room for empty excuses or half-truths. They sat down, and for a moment, the silence was broken only by the distant sound of a clock ticking time. Laura began, her voice trembling but determined, recounting how she had come to the point of betraying not only Ethan, but also the principles she had always said she valued. She spoke about feelings of emptiness, about the desire to be seen again, something that, according to her, had disappeared over time. "I'm not trying to justify what I did," she said finally, looking directly at him. "I know what I did was wrong, in every way. But I needed you to know that, despite everything, I never stopped loving you. I just didn't know how to deal with what I was feeling." Her words fell on Ethan like a weight, but at the same time, they brought unexpected clarity. He knew that what Laura felt was not something that could be easily resolved with words or promises. There were deep wounds, both hers and his, that needed to be faced, and there was no guarantee that they would emerge from this process in one piece. "You say you still love me," he replied, his voice full of restrained emotion. "But how can I believe that after everything that's happened? How can I trust you again, knowing that you chose to hide all of this from me, knowing that you allowed our daughter to carry this weight alone?" Laura tried to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. It was their daughter, who had arrived earlier than expected. She stopped when she saw her parents sitting together, the tension in the air evident. "Are you guys talking?" she asked, her voice hesitant but full of hope. Ethan looked at his daughter, realizing for the first time how much all of this had affected her too. "Yes," he said, with a sigh. "We're trying." The presence of their daughter brought a new perspective to both of them. They realized that no matter what happened between them, they would need to work together to ensure that she was no longer a victim of the choices they had made. Ethan looked at Laura, and for the first time since the party, there was something different in his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a recognition that there was more at stake than just the two of them. They spent the rest of the day arguing, not just about the past, but also about what the future could be. The conversations were tense, full of moments when emotions threatened to explode, but there were also moments of clarity, small glimpses that, perhaps, there was still something worth fighting for. Ethan knew it wouldn't be easy, that the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but for the first time, he also realized that he didn't need to make all of his decisions at once. At dusk, Laura approached him hesitantly. "I know I can't change the past," she said, her voice low. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to try and rebuild what I destroyed, if you give me the chance." Ethan looked at her, and for a moment, the silence between them was deeper than any words could be. He knew that the decision would not be made right then, but he also knew that the first step had been taken. When he went to sleep that night, he felt that, for the first time in a long time, there was a small, almost imperceptible light at the end of the tunnel. It wasn't the solution to all the problems, but it was a start. And for Ethan, at that moment, that was enough. The days following that conversation were silent, almost surreal, with an underlying tension permeating every interaction between Ethan and Laura. Both were stuck in emotional limbo, trying to understand how to move forward while carrying the shattered pieces of everything they had built together. Ethan spent hours alone, often walking aimlessly through the streets or sitting in cafes, as the confusion in his mind deepened. Laura, on the other hand, remained in the house, staring into space as if waiting for it to give her answers she didn't know where to find. Their daughter, watching everything from a distance, felt the weight of uncertainty and anguish, although she didn't know how to help. Ethan finally made a decision. He arranged to meet with a divorce lawyer, someone who could advise him on how to protect his interests while ensuring that Laura and her daughter would not be harmed financially. During the meeting, while reviewing the couple's assets and possible divisions, he realized that marriage was not just an emotional union, but also an intertwining of lives, stories, and responsibilities. It hit him unexpectedly. He wasn't just closing a chapter, I was dismantling an entire life. Laura, in turn, knew that Ethan was moving further and further away. She tried to talk to him, but her attempts seemed to get lost in a wall of pain and resentment that he had erected. She couldn't blame him for that, he knew it was entirely his fault. Even so, hopelessness began to consume what little strength he had left. She knew that rebuilding her marriage was an almost impossible task, but what tormented her even more was the possibility that she would never be able to regain the trust and respect of her own daughter. It was during one of these attempts at reconnection that Laura finally found the courage to approach Ethan directly. She found him in the living room, his expression closed but less hardened than in previous days. She sat across from him, no rehearsed words, just the truth she felt. I know this may seem too late, but I need to say that I'm sorry for everything. Not just for what I did to you, but for what I did to us, to our family. I know I can't change the past, but I want to do my best to be better, even if it means letting you move on without me. Ethan listened to her in silence, his eyes fixed on her as if searching for something. He didn't respond immediately, but something in his posture suggested that he was, for the first time, considering not just anger, but also the possibility that they might both somehow find a way forward, together or apart. The dilemma was not just emotional. There were practical issues to resolve, such as the house, shared bills and, above all, their relationship with their daughter. They decided that, before taking any definitive step, they needed to talk to her honestly, something they had avoided until that moment. They called her for a talk, and she, although reluctant, agreed. They sat together at the dining table, where so many meals had been shared in simpler times, and began to talk. Ethan was direct but careful, explaining that he and Laura were trying to figure out how to move forward, but that nothing would change the fact that they would both remain her parents and that she was their priority. Laura, in turn, tried to express her regret, but was interrupted by her daughter. I don't want an apology, Mom, she said, her voice firm but choked. I just want to know why you thought this was more important than us. Her words came as a blow to Laura, but they were also a starting point for a more honest conversation than either of them had had before. Meanwhile, Connor, the man who had played a central role in destroying the trust between Ethan and Laura, was also facing consequences of his own. His wife had found out, and he was now in the midst of a messy separation, while desperately trying to keep in touch with his daughter, Sophie, who refused to speak to him. Connor realized too late how much he had destroyed not only his own life, but also the lives of others, and it consumed him. He tried, in vain, to contact Laura, but she cut all ties, determined not to allow him to continue to interfere in her life. The following months brought inevitable changes. Ethan decided that despite all of Laura's efforts to rebuild trust between them, he could no longer live with the shadow of betrayal hanging over their marriage. The divorce was finalized relatively amicably, with Ethan ensuring that Laura and her daughter had the support they needed to move forward. He sold the house they had lived in together and moved to a smaller apartment, where he began to build a new life, still uncertain about what the future held for him, but determined not to let the past define who he was. Laura remained in the city, trying to rebuild her life. She dedicated herself to strengthening her relationship with her daughter, who, although she still carried hurt, was beginning to make room for forgiveness. Laura knew this was a long and difficult journey, but she was willing to face whatever was necessary to prove that she could be a better person. In the end, they each found their own path. Ethan, after months of introspection and adaptation, met someone who brought lightness and renewal to his life. Laura, in turn, found strength in her independence, learning to rediscover herself and seek meaning outside the shadows of her mistakes. Connor faced the consequences of his choices, isolated and forced to deal with the ruins of his own life. This story is a reminder of how our choices can shape not only our lives, but also the lives of those around us. Betrayal is never the way to go, and the scars it leaves are deep, often permanent. Now, we want to know what you thought of this story. Leave your comment, share your opinion, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Here, we do not support treason. Our goal is to show how it can devastate lives and teach lessons that are valid for all of us. Until next time.